Okay, I think we should start. Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Alexander Strogorsky and I'm teaching at the Moscow Architecture School March. Welcome to another event of our series of talks on architectural education, its present state and possible future. This meeting will be held in English, so if you need a translation, you can use the globe icon on the control panel in your Zooms to switch to translation. Встреча пройдет на английском языке, и вы можете воспользоваться значком глобуса на панели управления, чтобы переключиться на перевод. As usual, I'll start with a very short introduction, and well, it's our 9th conversation, and I was thinking of the time when we started it early in June, and I was thinking that to a certain extent, the idea of these conversations came up as a way to transform the frustration which came with the pandemic to transform it into a self-study and a kind of research experiment. So it was 50% coping mechanism and 50% investigation of the multiplicity of forces which drives architectural schools in sometimes very opposite directions. And as I was saying many times before in the beginning of these talks, we're happy not to impose any specific agenda on our guests, but because of the generosity we could learn from their thoughts and experience, we're letting them to define the direction of the conversation for themselves. And it was also very important for us because of that, to invite participants representing different generations of educators and different schools and different traditions of schooling. And I'm very glad to introduce our guests today, who are coming from the younger generation of educators, having a fresh view and critical view of educational apparatus. So today with us are Piergianna Mazzocca, whose research interest is focused on medicalization of architecture. Piergianna obtained her Bachelor of Architecture from the University of the Andes in Merida in Venezuela, and a Master of Science in Architecture and Urban Design from the Delft University of Technology. And she has taught at Rice University in Houston, Texas. We actually had some guests from Rice University very recently. And currently, Piergianna is the Emerging Scholar in Design Fellow at the School of Architecture, also the University of Texas in Austin. And Anastasiia Gerasimova, she's an architect, researcher, and a teacher at Moscow Architecture School March. Before that, Anastasiia has taught at University Architecture School in Ufa and at School of Form in Poznan in Poland. She's a graduate of the Berlagi Center for Advanced Studies in Architecture and Urban Design, she had initiated her ongoing research about the culture and aesthetics of the banya, the traditional Russian steam bath. And in parallel with teaching, she's a practicing architect with experience from different fields and bureaus, including Studio Makink and Bay in Rotterdam and number of architectural bureaus in Europe and Russia. This is where I stop. And as usual, in an hour maybe from now, we'll have some time and some space to ask questions, and then I'll be back with some first questions and then questions from the audience. Please, Anastasiia and Piergianna, please start your conversation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Alexander, for the invitation and for introducing us today. Anastasiia and I are very honored by the opportunity to participate in this series of thought-provoking conversations. The topic of our conversation today is the body and how we have seen the current events changing the notions of the body at the center of our own research. But more specifically, we'll be addressing how the body has been framed in our experiences, both teaching and learning. And how can our reflections on these issues help map productive ideas for understanding the state in which we operate as young researchers and scholars. A little bit of house cleaning. The conversation will then gravitate around 3 themes. The first one is the absence and presence of bodies inside the classroom. The second one is the body inside the institutional setting, specifically how these institutional settings have helped us frame our constructions of the body. And finally, the body as reference. We will address these topics formally but mostly informally, depending on how heated or not our answers to these themes are. So if you're ready to go, Anastasiia, let's do this.
Yes. Well, I would like to start from the notion of the collective body in the classroom setting, especially since we have only Zoom and not the classroom nowadays. And I mean, our common experience of the collective body in the classroom, which is, of course, the Berlage. As was already mentioned, that me and Piergianna was studying at the Berlage together in the same year. And our director of education program and our teacher, Salomon, he would always encourage us to work in the classroom and not home alone. And I believe like this very strong bond within the generation and with other generations at the Berlage was happening because a lot of work, and I mean individual work, since, well, everyone hates the collective one. And even if it is individual work, but by doing it in the same space at the same time, with the interactions, discussions, and suggestions from peers from one to another, it was like very, like that was what created basically, well, the culture of the classroom and the culture of the school in case of the Berlage. And well, I guess this conversation is also the result of that. And yeah, we spoke before that also we've learned actually, well, all of us have learned from each other much more than we learned from the tutors, for instance. So this precise experience was happening in the studio space. And I believe that this presence of bodies is what formulates it. And from my experience as a teacher, like my most concerns to the pandemics was not how static our online education is, but rather is how static the offline education is apparently. Our classes, they didn't change that much like during this online 3 months process. And that made me think that, I mean, like I thought that something must be wrong with the offline mode and not with the online situation. So like, yes, we were consulting students and like discussing projects, and like it was just the same like it would be in the studio space. And I've like realized how must be boring our classes if they're so easily replaceable by Zoom, you know. And I think that education today in the classroom is in general a kind of a laboratory with the laptops. And if we need, like, for instance, to explain how to draw a window, we would do it graphically instead of actually coming to the window and, well, explaining how it is. And I think like for all those also technical issues, I think classroom is very hermetic space, and our classes therefore is like in this hermetic environment, because we don't go really that much to the build site, for instance, to explain to address those technical issues on a certain stage of the project. And also like the field trips, I would say, must be more often, you know. But like all those things, again, they come as a reflection to being, of course, locked down in the Zoom classes for 3 months. So I guess I wouldn't complain that much about our classroom culture previously, but now it makes me see it a bit differently. But also, if I would look at the classroom culture itself today, I think it is very much dependent on the technology already, and that's why Zoom like didn't change it that much. And we think that the bodies in the Zoom are the passive bodies, but I believe that they're already passive regardless like online or offline regime there is. And in fact, students are all like sitting with the laptops in immaculate space and using only one hand and the mouse. And I thought about this kind of situation, like indeed like that there's only one hand that, you know, activates from the whole body of a student. And I was reading this essay of Irina Sirotkina, who is writing like a lot about this kinesthetic learning and everything. And I liked how she describes the process of the first year pupils at primary school learning how to write, that at first, like the whole their body would be involved in the process, that like their back will be bended and their tongue will be sticking out because they're trying so much. So like it is the full involvement of the body in the learning process. And then when they already learned, it is just writing with one hand, and preferably the right one. So I thought it actually reflects a lot on the educational process, that indeed like first like 2 years you at least like yes do craft and hand drawings, but then it is more and more about just one hand. So that made me think and like question what is missing in the study environment. And the first thing, of course, that came to my mind, since Alexandra also mentioned my experience at Studio Mackinnon Bay, that influenced me a lot. And in this office, it was a very strong culture of one-to-one blue foam prototypes. So I thought that like coming back to the idea of prototypes in the architectural education in one-to-one scale is quite important, since like that scale-wise there, I mean, I think that scale-wise, yes, you can relate to your own body proportions, but also because like those prototypes, they're almost real. It is like kind of almost reality, but then there is like still a potential to change something. And I think it's yeah, it's just very nice tool for training. And of course, I think that the collective act of making those prototypes is also important for the studio culture. And I think the good example of that would be Neufert, when he was teaching in Bauschule, and he would be using this. He was obsessed with the DIN 476 format, A0, A3, A4 paper formats, and yes, he was like he would encourage. He established an order that everything in the classroom was aligned to those formats, and in case that, like in this case, it was like that all the objects that students were using or interacting with, they were becoming a certain prototypes, and it was a certain proportional grid to which everything would be aligned to. So it was like systematizing the space, and yeah, I think it's kind of domestication of the classroom, but then in a conceptual way. So I believe that after Zoom reality, I wish we come back to classrooms that have this atelier type, and it would become just like more inhabited. But also I believe that it's important to continue using a body as a measurement tool. I mean, literally, and it is like going to centuries backwards. But for instance, like to measure the distance with the feet, the amount of the material with your hand, or the length of the textile with the elbow. There is a variety of body parts as a tool in Russian measurement system. Like, for instance, different parts of hands together, spans between like different fingers and so on. So I think that could come back and extend like the program of the first year, for instance, because it implies the kinesthetic understanding of space and the perception of the volume. And rather than like, trying to measure space with quite, well, with meters, which is, I think, very abstract mathematical concept, especially like when it's the first year of the bachelor. And I know that you also have a lot of pedagogical methods of your own in activation a body in the classroom. So the first project that you did, you told me about the power of beds. So yeah, I'm curious because I know that you actually did it not once, but like more, and you experimented with that.
Yeah, I mean, many of the themes and topics that you've touched upon are also part of what I am currently thinking, and how to implement and how to change in the way I teach. And when you talk about kinesthetic knowledge, or how do we situate our bodies as as the measure and as the beginning of questioning the world around us, I have one example of that, which is one of the first assignments that I always give in the design studios that I've taught, both at Rice and at UT Austin. And this assignment is called Little Powers of Bed. which draws from Charles and Ray Ames' video Powers of 10. If you guys will know this movie, a fixed frame presents content inside that frame in scalar intervals. It deals with the relative size of things in the universe and the effect of adding a zero, which is how they explained the video. So the assignment proposes the use of such a method, like a fixed frame, a scale content, and an analytical as an analytical and projective tool. So I asked the students to produce 2 series of drawings of their own bedroom using a perspectival plan, each with an increasing scale. So in the first series, students have to map and draw the content of their rooms as it is, right, in all of its detail. More and more detail gets added as you zoom in, or and less detail gets out as you zoom out. So information about the rooms adjacent to your own room, the pieces of the city outside the room's window, or the fluffy rug next to the bed, all of those things need to be mapped. So this meticulous observations seek to reveal the connections that such spaces have when drawn on different scales, the sort of information we add or leave behind, and how they communicate, who we are and how our bodies, interact with the objects of everyday life. But then for the second series, I always ask the students to change something in their beds, right? And then, how that change actually modifies or echoes through all of the scales. So the purpose of the assignment is to pay attention to how these objects that we interact with also change and modify the spaces we occupy, and also how we see one another through the object's use and its representation. The drawing sometimes, become like this very personal depictions of my students' identities. So one of the things that I am asking myself these days that has helped me change my attitude, even towards my own research, has to do precisely with the idea that objects have, in my own work, substituted bodies in space. For example, like this assignment will be obsolete if I were to teach remotely again this fall. The screen is now, like the perfect window, that perspectival view, but, from my, Zoom perspective into my students' own bedrooms. I don't know why students do this, but they're constantly calling me from their bedrooms, and I'm seeing now more clearly than ever, but it was always the goal of the assignment, right? To see my students represented in their drawings. So in the context of this conversation and, what it means to have body practices inside the classroom, then my position is this, right? I think that the absence of our bodies inside the classroom describes the sort of aseptic scenario that you also mentioned, that privileged technology in unprecedented ways. And now I'm seeing how questions regarding, digital equity, universal accessibility, and the flattening of our bodily experiences can seriously damage how we use the body to attain knowledge of the world around us. So I think that the more we privilege virtual spaces for architectural discussion, the more we separate ourselves from other forms of knowledge that might relate to experience, which is this sort of mention, how this relates to what you mentioned on regarding kinesthetic ways of knowing, and which is something that has always been of interest for architects. Maybe to continue our discussion, one thing that I also wanted to bring into the series of observations, I think this conversation is just a catalog of observations. It has to do with the question of discomfort in the educational setting, because it has some parallels also with the absence and presence of bodies in space. So if we think of the educational setting as a site of discomfort, like inherently is a uncomfortable space, we start to understand like the pedagogical possibilities of awkward exchanges, then the defiance posed by ways of doing and thinking that are different from your own, and the exposure and exhibition of ideas that, might disrupt commonalities. And, that sort of precondition of the disruption of commonalities has always been a precondition of the creation of new knowledge. you know, and having this conversation with other colleagues, and also with you in the past, we have said, well, yeah, of course, Zoom meetings are awkward as well, right? Like there is already like an embedded discomfort in this sort of exchanges. But I think that the difference lies in the fact that while one finds discomfort in the online format itself, because of this disruption of previous familiar spaces, the other considers the presence of bodies in space as the agents of discomfort, right? And let me explain this just by clarifying that I see bodies containing meaning, right? Like if in my assignment, the bed, you know, contained meaning, embodied, you know, the bodily experience, I now see bodies as containing meaning as well. For example, like noticing how diverse or not the student population of my class is, or, you know, like the lack of female faculty inside, you know, X institution. For me, you know, bodies as markers or as having embedded mute forms of knowledge have nothing to do with the familiar setting of one person giving a lecture and another group, you know, people listening online. So discomfort, this discomfort goes beyond that. And I think that it makes us aware of the information we bring into the classroom, right? And the things that we get out of that interaction. So I think that in Zoom, and at least in my experience, most of my students, or like in, you know, large super populous courses, a lot of my students just opt out of turning on their video. And so I think like the signs that those bodies emanate become invisible.
Yeah.
So anyways, these are my thoughts, Anastasiia. So I would like to hear from you. How do you see these changes in your own experiences teaching online?
Well,
so like, yeah.
I would want to refer to like what you said about this kind of flattering that happens. Like you refer to different genders and nationalities, like that are that give you a certain information also about the class, and you can observe the like behaviorology and everything. And it's important that all those bodies are present. But I think there is also something, well, liberating about that. And well, it is rather an anecdote from my side, but yeah, I've noticed that that, for instance, I've been observing what places in the classroom students choose when they enter. And especially like it refers to our dissertation course, which is in March. Well, it's quite a big course, and I mean, there are a lot of students, and the auditorium is quite big, and it has basically 3 settings, and there are tables in the row in the front. There are like separate standing chairs in the back for individuals, and there is like a big couch on the left side of the classroom. And this couch is like a very chilly space, and especially like if you make some presentation and switch off the light, you basically don't know like who's sleeping there or not. And yeah, and of course it is a bit about stereotypes, but like seriously, even like first taking the work of a student, you know, like when you check their texts, and then you recall in your head like what exact spot they, you know, like you recall the setting where they were sitting. And like I mean, it cannot be coincidence that it is always like all the straight A students sitting on the front, and like always the ones who submit late, they would be from the couch group. So, and I thought that that yes, it is like Zoom doesn't allow you to apply those stereotypes, because there is no basically spots that you can take. And I thought in a way it is liberating, and it like erases this kind of difference. But I actually wanted to ask you about one more thing, referring to your research and to the bed topic, because you once told me about this drawing circles lecture of Xenopsa Alexandra, but like you, the one who introduced me to the scholar first time, so I heard about it only from you. And I just wonder, yeah, like if you could say more about those bodily practices that she was using, since it is also an American scholar.
Yeah, I also came into in let's say I became familiar with her work just because I was interested in understanding what other modes of knowledge right? We can introduce in the classroom and, in the creation of my own pedagogical project. And for me, it was incredible to find Zeynep Selik Alexander's book, Kinesthetic Knowing, because it helped me understand how educational models have engaged bodily senses and experiences in the past, right? So her book traces the history of that way of, or traces the history of such educational models. So for example, in her book, she describes the mechanisms that have historically supported this sort of pedagogical practices where, body movements, sorry, tactile sensations and concrete artifacts can be translated into built spaces, right? Like how do we embed that sort of knowledge into what we do? And the ways in which this form of knowing appears have always suggested like a codification of the things we learn through physical experience. And I think like she does a marvelous job just tracing the methodological construction of such knowledge and how it has perpetuated itself in design schools and institution over decades. So we tend to think also about, the sort of architecture that the Bauhaus did, right? Like as this modern, rational architecture, but like also within the Bauhaus itself, like there were many experiments, and she mentions such experiments by, Moholy-Nagy, in which, the body was the site of, architectural interrogation. And, watching some of her lectures online, one of the examples that for me became extremely important in understanding also, and going back to your comment on how you would love for bodily parts to become the mechanism by which we measure the world. She gives like an example, like a very nice example of a sort of experiment. I don't remember the name of the author, but it was about how do you explain someone what a circle is, right? Like, of course, you can rely on geometry and say that a circle is just like a infinite amount of points that are equidistant to a point in the middle, right? But then how do you do that in practice, right? So she explained how this researcher would ask students to stand next to a blackboard with a piece of chalk in their hands and just, detach their arm from their body and then just draw, trying to maintain that distance, right? So I thought that was incredible. And those are the sort of things that, I continue to be interested in and how to incorporate that into my own work. So, and what is interesting then is like, how this other ways of knowing then also mark, very particular institutional settings. And I think like, I don't know how you feel about this, but maybe we should jump to our next thing, which is institutional setting and the many lenses, institutional lenses that allow us to frame our constructions of the body. So in our preliminary conversations, we always went back to discussing how the different institutions where we have been and where we have been trained or where we have taught has made us change or reconsider, the ways in which we approach the theme of the body, right? Like I only got acquainted to Alexander's work by coming to the US, right? So it is important maybe to reflect on how the theme of the body in our own work and in our teaching and how we ourselves conduct inside the classroom has been marked by the institutional settings in which we operate. So this is going to become like a little bit autobiographical, so bear with me. You will do the same. But for the but for the audience that are watching, I have been trained as an architect in Venezuela at a public university, and later I did my master's degree at the Berlage in the same way as you did inside TU Delft. And I can say that both approximations to the topic of the body differ enormously, right? If I compare both settings. And to be honest, I was never exposed to political or for that matter, biopolitical concerns in my university back home. or maybe not under like the same critical lens, because even though I was indeed exposed to critical decolonial literature and to the histories of architecture, both colonial and pre-colonial, I think like the default educational framework centered around the modern Western canon and the application and design curricula of, architectural standards derived from, European models. So I think that a crucial moment in my education actually, as you also mentioned before, came through the exposure to my classmates, during our time together at the Berlage, and the introduction from part of the faculty there to, the sort of critical spatial practice that characterizes the center today. So I know that you had similar experiences to mine, so I would like for you to expand on them and then possibly set them as examples on how, differing institutional settings have made you rethink your own methods and your own research approaches.
Yeah, well, yeah, I've been also studying in a public university in Ufa, Ural Mountains, as I always add. And it's like a standard 6-year educational program. Well, it is quite standard, but though, of course, there are like certain radical pedagogies that also, well, emerge there from time to time. However, it was the first time when I went to study abroad. I got this like scholarship to go for the exchange, and it was like, the first student going for exchange to Europe, and it was Vienna Technical University. And yeah, it was like the first time I've been exposed to a very important word that multidisciplinarity. And it was like in the best European tradition. And I mean, yeah, it's amazing how we hate this word now and how like incredible and enlightful it was back then. And yeah, like actually, like again, relating to the body subject, like we had and to this multidisciplinarity. In one of our courses at TU Wien, we had even like invited ballerina from the Vienna Ballet Theater who would work with us and like doing like interesting exercises about finding a comfortable spot in the classroom, or like making a body combinations of different architectural elements. And it was like, again, like collective body, weaved into each other. And like, it was way out of comfort zone. And also, I don't know, there were strange exercises with even audio and the perception of space. Like, let's say we would be like walking in Karl Marx Hof, Red Vienna, and then having in our headphones the description, like the woman describes the setting in the New York. So then we would have this kind of transposition in our head of different perceptions and so on and so on. So there were a lot of those experimental exercises, and that was all very new for me. So when I came back to Ufa after this European experience, I had to do a thesis. So I did my diploma, well, based on this European experience, and it was totally rejected back home. And they were all claiming that, well, this is not architecture. So that was actually perhaps also when I started to question what is architecture. And yes, like it was very, well, it was a lot of frustrations. Again, like coming from a very formalistic background and being like exposed to something, yeah, outside of the discipline, outside of, talks about form. And yes, also I think another issue, well, that concerns a lot of republics in Russia with ethnical minorities, that the major issue in this context is the national identity within, let's say, the empire. So these identity questions, they basically drive all of the discussions in educational settings, and in general, they like kind of formulate this discourse in itself, and that's a lot of problem solving and never problematizing. So yeah, I guess it's a bit unhealthy. But then I guess I found my answers about this like polemics between form and mixing with different disciplines at the Berlage, actually. And yes, I think that, well, for me, the answer was the typology. And we discussed with you also previously when we just arrived at the Berlage, that like before we were not exposed to this typology notion to that extent, like in our previous education. And then like whether it's in the Netherlands, it was like such a fundamental thing to speak about. So for me, typology was the answer of how can you speak like of all possible things that you want to speak through your own discipline. And like, for example, that I always wanted to speak about naked body. And, I just had to pick an architectural type for that, which is banya, the bathhouse. And therefore, yeah, like it just allows you not to fall out of your discipline, like stay professional, So yeah, but recently I had a discussion with my colleague about types, and he was telling me about this pavilion that they were designing, and the pavilion didn't have any specific function or program, and it was like an overall space for like things to happen. And like it was all fine, but at some point when they were discussing with the engineer, he actually started to demand to name the type and to define it, because they needed like to understand what norms or like fire safety regulations to apply to that. So it made me think that maybe typology just goes way beyond of architecture, and there are like plenty experts in allied disciplines that need like typology in order to communicate and refer to a certain place. But what was surprising for me also that at March, actually, I wouldn't say that like typology was, I wouldn't say that it is part of the discourse. It is present to a certain extent, but it's not like in the Netherlands that this is the major topic that we would all discuss. And I also likely had the conversation when Tom Emerson came to Moscow to March to give a lecture, and yes, he also told me that he doesn't actually use the word typology, well, for many reasons, but also that it became a sort of a hype in like all architectural schools. So maybe I'm happy in a way that at March, they don't take that hype, sort of. But what I also like about March is that the themes and questions that they raise they don't relate to like any of my previous experience. Like we talked, I think, with you before, that because we come to study or to teach in different schools all the time, that there is also a feeling of being a freshman sort of all the time. Like you're all the time exposed to something, you all the time have to adapt. So yeah, in the March, I like that the themes that they address they're very refreshing. And well, just as example, I don't know, like, there was a lecture on the topic of genuineness. Like, how beautiful is that, Like, it's not a lecture on, I don't know, modernism or any other isms, but it's like, about something more, with a more wider scope. And yeah, also the good example would be the master course of our director, Eugene As, that makes, he does the studio every year of rethinking, and he rethinks like very abstract, but at the same time very fundamental constructs, like rethinking gravity or rethinking beauty. Like it's like the whole.
I'll take that studio.
Exactly. Thank you. Well, I mean, that would be great, but yes, like the whole vocabulary is different, and like we would never think about rethinking beauty in the Netherlands. That would be like just something weird and completely. Well, I think, yeah, the topics in March are like something beyond the, I don't know, standard topics I've been exposed in like European, in European context. And I think also that in Dutch context, one could also sense a lot of like repetitions, of the same themes, same word constructions that people use. And there are like certain topics to address, and it seems it's like a right thing to do. So everyone does. So I think that, yeah, in this case, I like this kind of refreshment that I get from March, but at the same time, it's also challenging because I've been already trained, to speak in the Netherlands, institutional settings. And I think I also told you once that that after, like when the Berlage had these online presentations, and I was listening to the crits, and I thought, wow, like in order to, like if you, because it's like very like strong, economical, political line of research over there. And I thought that if you need to be a crit at the Berlage, you need geopolitics knowledge. If you want to be a crit at March, I would say you need like a knowledge of theater and literature. So that for me pretty much like sums up the difference. But I mean, still, Russia is also in a way part of Europe. So I guess regardless of the differences, is probably not as contrasting to the US like academic setting. So I also wonder what kind of like what discourse and what vocabulary also you use there.
Well, yeah, that is always the hardest question, because it also reflects the sort of trauma that I carry when I moved from Europe to the US. I just have to also, make a bit of a disclaimer. I also thought that the US was like this uniform, architectural identity as well, and this uniform discourse. But of course, like there is like the West Coast architect, LA kind of architectural scene versus the East Coast, mostly centered around schools in New York, or Eastern
Yeah.
American schools. And when I came to the US, I didn't go to either of those poles. I actually ended up in Texas, and I've been here for the past 3 years, and I'm going to be here for one more year. And I've been and I've had the privilege to teach at both Rice University and the University of Texas at Austin, which have historically also remain like at the margins of those big discursive centers in American academia. So in a way, it has been liberating. In other ways, it has been excruciating, because in the same way as you were telling me about your own experiences, for me, arriving at the US, it was like starting from scratch, like trying to relearn what architects are, what architects do, and how architects teach, right? And I think like the vocabulary completely changed. The way I talked about architecture, the way I described architecture had to be reinvented, or recalibrated to address the set of concerns, and like the climate of both schools, right? I think that at Rice University, at least, there was it also depends a lot of the climate of the faculty teaching at the time, but at the time that in which I started teaching there, I felt that there was like a push towards seeing architecture just as buildings, and how do we position ourselves into that. And I thought that I had overcome that that like the role of the architect could be more expensive than just talking about architecture in those terms. And then at the University of Texas at Austin, which I am currently teaching, I feel like there is a huge directive from part of the administration and the faculty to promote a more practice-based kind of education, right? So and in that way, like I feel like I have to go back also to the roots of my architectural education, technical education back home. So in a ways, I'm fine with that. I always find like a territory to push back and to introduce my own ideas. I am also, well, something that I really like about the American context in that sense is like well, the role of the fellowship, like the research and teaching fellow, that kind of position, in which you, because you are at a short-term position, and you're young by definition, apparently. I have encountered like very old fellows, but it gives you a lot of freedom also to reinvent pedagogical approaches in design curriculum, but also then for your own research to create your own seminars, and to dictate a sort of research agenda that then becomes very unique to my own research. So yeah, so that's it. That's how I can describe the dichotomies in American academia, but also what I encountered when I came here.
But though about vocabulary, like for instance, even this phrase that you use, the forms of knowledge, like I think I've never heard that before. You wrote that in the intro. I thought, okay, this might be like maybe some teaching methods or something, but actually I don't know like precisely each semantic value of the word. And I thought it's maybe some American phrase or something, like construct, the word construct, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, well, thanks for asking. But yeah, the term like forms of knowledge is something that I think I started borrowing from Carlo Ginzburg, historian, from his essay, Clues, Roots of a Scientific Paradigm. And actually, I became acquainted with that essay actually from Stefano Milani, who teaches at TU Delft, right? Yeah, but but I think that for me that was like a seminal or reading, and something that has allowed me to really contextualize my work and the sort of research that I do. The arguments that he poses in that essay is that it traces like new social and epistemological autonomy found in medicine, right? Like my research deals with how architectural knowledge has been framed with its exchanges with medicine, and the privilege that social sciences gave to medicine, which has allowed for the study of clues and minutiae, like traces, vestiges, and unconscious traits and responses, as the means to achieve a better understanding of the world. I'm going to quote Ginsburg because I think like this essentially summarizes what I mean by that. He says that forms of knowledge that are mute in that sense do not lend themselves to being either formalized or spoken. In knowledge of this type, imponderable elements come into play, and those imponderable elements are instinct, insight, intuition. So I have continued to use the term when alluding to the different ways in which knowledge is transmitted or formed. Probably it is more accurate to use ways of knowing, which is kind of what Zeynep Alexander does in her book, Kinesthetic Knowing. But up until now, and if it wasn't because you asked me this question like a week ago, I never reflected on the right nomenclature. But the appeal in the concept to me is that it allows the continuation of the epistemological model that Ginsburg describes, and because it allows for the recognition of forms of knowledge that have for too long been neglected and dismissed, and that is like the sort of knowledge that women have, or that children have, or lay ordinary men can have. So in a way, it has become a way for me to pay attention to the things that have fallen outside of or that expand the Western canon, right? And maybe to give you an example of this, I actually teach a seminar called, I taught a seminar called Making the Bed, in which it explored the bed as the site of female labor in both the hospital and the home, as well as everyday objects' relationship to health and architecture. So for me, it has become extremely influential on what is the object of my research, and in what ways I frame the connections between space, objects, and subjectivity. So yeah, that's it. I think that's the short explanation.
No, good. Yeah, I think when even by the sound, the forms of knowledge is definitely more tangible than way of knowing. So yeah. Thanks. I'll make a note card in the Vesper Live tradition.
Sounds good to me.
So shall we maybe move to the referential topic, because we have very small time left?
Yeah, of course. How do you want to do this? Would you like to bring maybe for those that have not been exposed to your let's say to your teaching, or maybe to the sort of pedagogical approaches to references that you bring inside the classroom? I have a question for you that might introduce the topic. And so I am curious first about a workshop that you taught a few years ago in Poznan at the School of Form, but maybe my biggest interest has to do with the question of references. What are the references that you use, and in what ways the use of references and bodies as references are productive in your own teaching?
Yeah, well, I think that to answer this question, I would start from, well, because yes, I thought, of course, since we were discussing before that we would touch this subject, and I was thinking about references, and I thought that Like even going, into the dictionary, I think as in Russian or as an English language, there are different also words that different school use for that. And well, first of all, there are analogies, references, and inspirations. Apparently, TU Berlin is using inspirations word instead of references. So I thought it's just interesting that, you kind of referring maybe to things in a different ways. And well, in my background, we always use the word analogies. But then the difference is that the analogies is something about repetition and something about copying and learning from this copying. And like you take the analogy to look for the solution for the like how someone was dealing with the similar problem. So it's for like particular solution. And reference is rather when you refer to something like in broader way, like it can be reference from another discipline, a quote, a painting, philosophy, like something that enriches your research and something that that helps you to build up this body of knowledge and indeed like expand the topic. And inspiration, it is rather something that well, stimulates you to do something. And yeah, it's something very sensible. So I think that it's very fundamental to count those differences in, and when it is addressed, like in the task to students, also to explain it to them, because like when you allowed to borrow something or to copy, and when you just refer to something as as something just that they're just enriching like your thoughts and not directly like drag it into your project. So but regardless of these semantics, I believe that there is another issue with referencing and referring, and it is the citation. And we normally think about citation like only in the text. But however, more and more I'm coming to the idea of actually using citations in the architectural project, because, well, first of all, it will show more like layers of the depth in your work. And I think it also would communicate it better. And I think that students would also work with references more consciously, because they consume a lot of references and analogies, of course, especially due to like the open internet sources and everything. And yeah, I think that like going through the analogies in the beginning of the project, I mean, architectural analogies with architectural buildings is just not allowed. I mean, it's sick, because even unconsciously they might then pile up the images and just produce something which will be fundamentally copying, but they wouldn't even realize it. So I think that unless it's a drawing or a model, you cannot really allow yourself to look at it. But it's like, it's a very, I think it's enormous, like the students should be very disciplined in that sense, And I believe that if projects would have also, citations, the references that were used, then like students would be more conscious and like what they refer to. And in a way, I think citations were appearing like at the Berlage because of the video format we had, that there would be images and videos that, yeah, in the end, we like through which we articulate our thoughts, and then we would have a list of it, like of citation in the end. But that's not exactly what I mean, because I imagine like, the typical representation of a project, the plans sections, the models, and then, like the list of references next to it. I think that would be great. And there is an example that I think we might have seen it even together when Harvard students were presenting their works in Rotterdam, and Rem was like reading this lecture on thinning, of course. And yes, they were liking those projects, and some of them were, well, at the Berlage we used a lot of energy in, like we put into the representation of projects. So there are also like some projects are very well, high level of representation, very like a lot of work. You see like that people worked hard. And then there is one project, and it was like one of the best there. And it was just it was some student who was researching in data centers, and it was just a rectangular, with columns. And in front of this model, there was lying a few books that he was referring to. And I was like, I was looking at these books and at this model, and I completely get like, the whole idea of the project. And I was like, wow, that is such a clean representation. Like, I mean, the books were like, you know, if there is the book Critical Originalism lying next to the project, you understand what the project is about. I mean, the direction. So that was the same. And I think it also like enriches, it's like that, I mean, yeah, I think that actually March has a similar tool, because all the students on the exhibition, on the, like every year exhibition, they indeed present their projects in a more typical way, the plans, sections, models, and everything. And then next to that, they would have a diary. And like when I first time came to March, I just fell in love, I think, with the school because of those diaries. Because the diaries are indeed very similar to these citations for the project's idea, I think. They have like all the theater plays, all the movies, buildings, whatever else they've seen during making the project that they decided to put into the diary, because it could this way or the other influence the project, and maybe unconsciously, maybe not very directly, but it is there. And it's like, it is very honest, I think. And you just open it, you know, and then you get like the whole depth of every line that they present over here. So yeah, I thought it's beautiful. But I'm afraid to speak kind of too long, but I don't know. Then shall I go
think you're
to
doing fine.
form? Okay.
Sorry, pardon.
I
Sorry.
mean, pardon, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, to the school of form issue.
Oh
Well,
yes, please do so.
Mm-hmm.
But give a little bit of context, though.
Okay, School of Form is the architecture. No, it's not architecture. It's the design school, School of Form in Poznan, Poland. It's kind of half Dutch based, half Polish. But it has international students, and the school is like presenting itself as a very crafty school. Like it's a lot about making and working with materials, with wood again, like, you know, but it's also a Polish context. So it is like a lot about this craftsmanship. So they don't really have that much theoretical courses, as I understood, and therefore I was conducting a theoretical sort of course, well, experimenting. Well, it was, well, broader context was already mentioned, that I was studying banya and the bathhouse as a collective act of bathing. But then in this case, it was how to like zoom in on the individual body, but not only zoom in, but also like, you know, deconstruct it and zoom in different parts of it. I'm afraid that it might sound creepy, but students were assigned on like different parts of the body, male and female, and yes, they were supposed to design a hygienic object for each separate, because I mean, there are plenty of typologists that deal with these kind of hygienic rituals on public, like for instance, I don't know, washing hands, or let's say Muslim religion prescribes to wash their feet and genitals before the prayer as most dirty parts of the body, and like washing, you know, hair at the barbershop and so on. So they exist to a certain extent, those types, but yeah, so they were supposed to create the prototypes of these hygienic objects, and then put all together. Those objects would be as a kind of bathhouse, as a car wash, that the human walks in and then each of his body part washes separately. So so yeah, but the important thing was that each of them were working with the proportions of their own body. So that was really cool, because I don't know, like there was this wonderful Korean student who made a certain thing for the shower for the knees, for old people actually, but then she was referring to her own body, and then I don't know, there was like one Russian tall guy, and then he couldn't use that. But so they were very like individual, and it was a lot about like they started, of course, from redrawing their own bathrooms, and it was kind of critiquing this standardization of the bathroom space, because like seriously, they redrew the bathrooms, like those students were from different countries and continents, and well, they were pretty all same, you know. So that's what it was about, that also this individualization of the objects. And I guess like in the theme of reference, it was important because they were using reference, well, since it's design and not architecture, it was very, well, didn't really have any boundaries. And they were asked to design very storytelling objects. And then therefore, of course, they would like address the cleanliness in many other way, like in mental way and metaphorical, but in physical as well. And I will just like, well, give you examples, I guess, better that, let's say if it's about knees, you can think about the knees of a prayer, or you can think about the open knees in the dress code, the appearance of the miniskirts, the appearance of feminist movements, and so on and so on. So, or you can, for example, there was one student who designed an object for the back, and he decided to use, well, he was referring to self-flagellation, and that you kind of clean the whole body from the seams through your back. So it was like, you know, from very trivial things, how to wash your feet, you can get to very like, you know, religion or theology or whatever. So I guess like they could refer to whatever they want, but they were like completely different. And it was, well, it was also very personal. So I think, yeah, overall it was nice. And of course, yes, prototypes one-to-one again.
I mean, I still think that that would have been the perfect workshop for me to attend as a student. I would have loved to, yeah.
Same about yours, you know, I feel same. So, but I think we both use a lot of the, like our group mates Berlagian's work as a reference.
Oh yeah.
Like, especially Pont.
Especially Pont, hi Pont. Yeah, we talked about this a few times about what are the things you share with your students in terms of, you know, providing better tools and better content for inspiration, and I think like both you and I agree that it works better when you share the work of people you know and projects that you know actually know.
Yes.
Not just as not just because you visited that building, but actually because you understand the context in which that particular project or idea emerged. So, you know, right now, I think that one of the biggest challenges in architectural education comes down to precisely that, right? The context that you help your students build, and what are the references and the sort of ideas that they take into consideration. For example, in my own in the way I teach, or I'm trying always to be very aware of who are the architects or researchers or designers that I give as a reference, right? I tend to avoid, you know, like the modern architect kind of passé discourse and, you know, examples. Like I'm fed up with that. And, you know, like I try to bring other voices and other ways of doing architecture that, you know, that have remained at the margins, right? So I think that one of the biggest things that I can take from my experience at UT Austin is, you know, the fact that there is like a Latin American research collaborative, right? In which we're trying to address decolonial histories, or how do we decolonize architectural education by bringing, you know, new voices and new examples of architecture that have existed outside of the Western canon, and that have made, you know, different bodies of knowledge, which I think, you know, becomes extremely relevant. And I also have to say, you know, like always trying to bring more female voices and more, you know, yeah, female bodies as references of, you know, our experiences as architects and researchers.
Yeah, I also, well, yeah, mostly then using, well, luckily we also have this video format that you can always show and share it in a clear way. Yeah, and then the fact that we know the process, how those works were made. I don't know really how students and other teachers react to that. I think they're also sometimes surprised, why would I, you know, bring someone I know? Is it just because they don't know anything else, you know? Or so yeah, I think it's important to bring like what you know, and as you said, that then at least you actually telling something that you know like fundamentally and understand it fundamentally, rather than speaking about, I don't know, building on God knows what continent at what year, like that you have no relation to. So yeah, but also I actually just realized, and if I might add, I don't know, I guess Sasha will just stop us soon.
Mhm.
That yes, when you asked me about school of form, I get though a bit uncomfortable, and since you talked about this comfort and not comfort, you spoke about
Discomfort.
discomfort. Yes. Yes, about yes, institutional setting. That when I remember this workshop with body parts, like it was conducted. Well, first of all, it was conducted in Europe, but second of all, it's just that since we're speaking here on the March program of like deschooling, and I just wouldn't know if I would be able to, if I would feel like making those workshops, you know, for example, in Russian context, and not like March is not liberating, because it is liberating school, but I just don't know if it's something about me that I wouldn't probably dare to do that there. Is it like my concerns in my head about my own context, or is it indeed like some kind of well, something how I maybe feel about Moscow, maybe about the variety of students though, because, you know, the fact that those students were different nationalities and different genders and different sexual orientations somehow made all those topics to be fine to discuss. And I don't know, like I told you before that there were, for instance, among the body parts, there were like obviously genital parts, and like there was wonderful Israeli students who made a very nice theoretical project, like critical project about circumcision, and indeed critiquing like that these, you know, obscene rituals still exist in 21st century and so on. But then like, because I had like those people from different contexts that could share this experience, and that would be something very enlightening to the others, something interesting, that was, I think, made it also a comfortable thing to speak of. But there is like, I don't know, if you in very, well, I guess you can say maybe about Texas in Austin, as I would say in Moscow, that, you know,
no,
that there is no
I agree with
diversity
you.
sort of.
Yeah, that this relates to, you know, why we wanted to address the institutional setting and how we construct you know, our versions of the body, right? Like, I know that I have to be very politically correct when I speak, and also what are the issues that I am allowed to bring into the classroom, right? But today, right, like there is a claim, not just from the faculty, not just only from the students, but from the population at large, that we need to have these conversations, right? Like as uncomfortable and as the crazy amount of painful discomfort that we might feel by, you know, introducing ourselves as, you know, agents of change, or as agents of, you know, empowerment to those other voices that sometimes have not been given the chance to speak out. I think like we are dealing with this, right? And I think like it is our responsibility right now as educators, as, you know, instructors, and especially us, that we are already markers of change, right? Like the fact that you and I are teaching in different ways and in various parts of the world, you know, can attest to that, right? Like that we're part of that generation that is seeking to speak out and to speak about this, you know, uncomfortable topics that have always existed at the margin of architecture, right? But because there has been this institutional narrative, or whether it is, you know, architecture with a capital A, that has, you know, determined what the right narrative or discourse should be, versus, you know, like all the different divergent narratives that, you know, make, oh, American academia, European version of the academia, you know, the Russian setting. So yeah, I do think that we are indeed, you know, reckoning with that, and I think that, you know, it is liberating, right, to you and I having this conversation in this setting today. I think like if the same conversation were to be conducted by two men, I would have not been watching, right? So I think that is important, right? Like, and again, I think that one of the biggest satisfactions for me of having this conversation with you today is that then our bodies are markers, right? Like we are two female bodies in this conversation series, right? And not because maybe I don't know, not because of the sort of well, or not because people know our work that much, or because we're famous or anything, like we're not, but it is because of the sort of perspectives that we can bring, right, into those conversations, right? We're this young research up and coming scholars, and we're just trying to find our ways, right, to operate and inhabit this leftover spaces in, you know, the structures that are, you know, defining what architectural discourse is.
Exactly. Well, beautifully said.
Yeah, thank you very much for the conversation and for many interesting topics that you already discussed. I'd like to remind our viewers and listeners that we would be happy to get some questions from them, and I will address them to Piergianna and Anastasiia. But I wanted to start with a question for myself. From the beginning of your conversation and from where you started discussing how bodies can be used as a teaching instrument, I was thinking about all those students that we observe, and a kind of altered state of the bodies that they living through the school environment, all these overnights and tons of coffee and that sort of things. Yeah. And also many of them are quite young, so their bodies are also coming through some kind of transformations coming from their age and so on. So I was thinking, actually it's not really a question, but maybe just something to share and to hear from you. What do you think about it? How this collection of bodies that we can have, that we can see in architecture schools, give a way for architecture that should serve a kind of very different, sometimes very different bodies, very different states of bodies. That's what I started thinking. Usually, I always think about how we, you know, have a tendency to extrapolate our very privileged states of being in architecture schools in academia on other people through architectural work or architectural speculation. And but another thing that I was immediately started thinking about is how the discourse about round bodies became focused on this kind of diversity, that there is no normality in all possible senses, races, ethnicity, gender, and so on and so on. So maybe what I wanted to ask you is, what do you think? How do you see any way the teaching methods or the system of schools could be changed to react to these differences, all of them? What do you think?
I mean, do you want to answer that, Anastasiia, or can I just give it a go?
Yeah, sure. Go.
Yeah, I think that this touches upon maybe vaguely on one of the most fundamental ideas that we brought today. We brought today into our conversation, which has to do with, you know, architects inevitably have the power to represent others, right? But the fact that we have that power, we are denying those others power to represent themselves, right? So that is like the biggest responsibility that we have, right? And I think, like, if those considerations aren't present in any conversation around architecture, then we're not doing a great job, right? So I do think that, as you said, Alexander, yes, we are very privileged to, you know, participate in the conversations around architecture, and occurring in, you know, in very famous and in very elite also institutions, right? So I think, like, part of then our responsibility is to recognize also that privilege, right? And and to understand in what ways we can use that privilege as a tool of empowerment for others, right? And also, you know, as you mentioned, like our student population and our students' population's bodies are also at different stages and states, right? So it's also understanding how there are no, you know, absolute universals, right? Especially when we're talking about bodies and the experiences of those bodies in space. What do you think, Anastasiia?
No, I thought more about that, what Alexandra said in the beginning about that, about this change that happens to the bodies at the university. And yeah, I just thought like how, of course, it is also autobiographical experience, but like how much changes when, I don't know, one student in the group breaks a leg and he has, you know, to like to get to the classrooms and so on. Well, March is lucky. I mean, at March there is an elevator, but that's not always the case. But I just remember like when something happens to the body of one student, like how it affects all the others, you know, like they also suddenly see a lot of like shortcomings and mistakes in the build environment around them. And yeah, I just thought about that it's like because of this compassion of the, again, like of this kind of group culture, the classroom culture that creates this kind of intimate relationship, how that influence all the rest. But yeah, also I think yeah, you talked a lot about that already, about this kind of, when you were speaking about the flattering by technology, this diversity in the classroom. But I think it's not something you can really push to emerge. I mean, I don't know, Alexandra, if we talk about our context, for instance, I guess it will naturally do that, and all that we can do is I don't know, use the right references.
Do you think that there could be some way of addressing this through design briefs, for example, speaking about typology versus non-typology approaches, for example, or anything else?
But well, I don't know.
I mean, for example, we could think that just as a reference, we could think of medical education, which is very aware of differences between bodies, because that's kind of crucial for doctors, right? For physicians to understand and to deal with, and partly, I guess it comes from working with corpses, and then from attending hospitals, and so on and so on. So they,
where are you going?
despite having a very, again, like with Neufert, despite having historically a very kind of normalized understanding of health and so on, they're much more aware of all the differences, no matter what they kind of discipline to think about it is wrong or bad. For example, obesity or something like that is good or bad, but they kind of much more, I guess, aware of that there are differences and people are different. So, but it comes with also the direct experience of working with other people on different stages of their lives and the students' lives. So just as a reference.
Yeah, I do think that, yes, you can incorporate these things into a design brief. I know that I try to do so. And one way in which I, ask my students to think about, the diverse bodies inhabiting their projects is actually introducing time, like the representation of time in their projects, right? Last semester, actually, I taught a design studio called Measures of Discomfort, in which one of the final part of the final assignment, or one of the final deliverables, was to actually represent the project throughout time, right? How the people, the end result was a house, right? It's nothing like fantastic about it, right? But But just to think about how a house changes over time, and how the people living inside that house might change, might grow, might they're able bodies one day, they're disabled bodies on another, right? So I think, like, yes, you can. You just have to embrace the discomfort of falling outside conventional architectural representation, I say. Right, like,
exactly, yes.
I mean, I'm a fan of black and white drawings. Anastasiia know this by heart, but is there the possibility of existing in a world where architectural convention also changes to indicate even the life of the materials we use for construction, for example, right? When we draw a wall, right, we're just talking about the construction system by which that wall is being built, but can we embed more information like that regards time, that regards how much time and labor it took to cultivate that piece of timber, right? So I would say that something similar can happen when we're addressing bodies, right? And Anastasiia knows this more than I do, but even representing those bodies in the drawings themselves, right? Like whether naked or wearing clothes.
Yes, but again, also what Alexandra said about yeah, that about the obesity, if it's good or bad. Like when we look at the representations and visualizations that students do, like the bodies that they pick, I mean, that's amazing. They like, we also had this discussion with one of the girls who was doing banya, like what colors of the skin you show on the naked bodies, and then do you have to actually show different colors of skin if it is like Siberian context, but though they have like international universities and whatever. So like it's those kind of choices. And I think that I even remember this, I tried even to look at it in the folder, but it's too far away. So basically this kind of Soviet standards drawing, that there is a drawing of the section of a bathroom, and there is the distance between the bathroom and the wall. Basically there is like a woman drawn that is making laundry, and then there is a correction with a pencil that her hips are much bigger, so the corridor width is not enough, and then the height of the bathtub is too high because her breast is also like very big when she's bending. So like I thought like that is amazing, that indeed, like I think if you take like a statistically well, I don't know, middle size of a woman in a, well, I don't know if it's in certain year or not, but they would have mostly this kind of body standard. And I guess through through educating students to represent these diverse bodies, that would probably would also like shift this kind of they would stop putting Barbies in their visualizations. I mean, I use Barbies a lot, but I use it also as a critical tool that like, yeah, I am against Barbies. That's why I like this topic. But then also what? Yeah, and especially with the bathhouses. Like, I'm sorry, can I just quickly say that since I've seen few projects of with the bathhouses of bachelor degree, and then there is always this Renaissance like paintings, naked people from there. Like my experience when I went to Banya from childhood, the strongest one is the body of hermaphrodite that I've seen. And it's like far from these perfections and whatever. So I guess like to be maybe more honest and conscious about diversity, that would improve their understanding.
Mm-hmm. We have we have one question, and we actually have just enough time for the one question. So, and it's question for Piergianna, and so it's quite long, but I will try to sum up. The question is about differences in approaches in academia on both sides of the Atlantic, and especially difference between PhD programs, and namely the paradigm of a purely scholarly American written PhD dissertation versus more kind of accustomed, maybe in Europe, PhD by design or research-based PhD, and so design-based PhDs. So, how do you experience these differences or changes, and maybe which one is better for the topic of our discussion?
Yeah, I think that the biggest difference obviously eradicates on the sort of education, or maybe to put it in different terms, like what constitutes academia in the US versus what constitutes academia in Europe. And I think like the way universities work in the US differs greatly from how they work in the European context, right? I would say that here, because this idea of tenure, like how do you actually, gain tenure, is by models of academic work and how you construct a body of knowledge, right? Through the processes that like the university allows you to go through in order to gain that tenure, right? And unfortunately for architecture, and the American PhD model follows what the PhD in the human sciences is, right? Which it has to come down to a paper dissertation, right? But it also, like, if you think about it, it's already embedded in the name, right? If you're doing a PhD in the history and theory of architecture and urban design, for example, what are the tools and the mechanisms by which history has been written and accumulated as knowledge, right? But there is a change actually happening right now, and it has to do with precisely that. How can we reinvent what a PhD in architecture could be, right? And an example of that is the PhD in design, or the Doctor in Design program at Harvard, right? In which you can indeed have a doctorate degree by conducting a sort of, design-oriented sort of research, right? That actually ends up becoming a project based rather than a written dissertation kind of a final outcome of it. And I think that this relates to also economic changes shaping architectural discourse, of course, right? And the spaces where architectural discourse happens, which is the kind of funding that schools have, right? Harvard being a private school, and having also to compete with for PhD students that might prefer to do a PhD in Europe because it's shorter, and here in the US it's between 5 to 6 years, versus the ETH PhD is 3 years, right? So I would say that it is part of also that, right? Like trying to understand like the audience and how students are also consumers of the sort of body of knowledge that academia is producing, right? That would be my answer.
Yeah, thank you very much. And listening to your answer and to the time frames that you name for producing, for example, a PhD, or for having a kind of education that, for example, I don't know, makes you a legit architect, or gives you an opportunity to have a licensing exam and so on. I think it's also somehow refers to the topic of our discussion, to body experience, because yes, 6 to 7 years, and before that also 6 to 7 years, maybe 10 years. It's bigger part of life for many people. It's
and actually, I have to say that here in the US, if you pursue a PhD in the history of architecture, you will only teach in the history and theory kind of structure of the design curriculum, right? So that is also something that you have to navigate, like trying to understand what the expectations of those degrees end up becoming for the definition of your own career. So yeah.
It would be definitely a limitation to opportunities of real practice also, I guess.
But I think that's what really very much divided over there, no? That then if you go academic, it's like you don't sort of combine it as.
Well, it happens very rarely.
Yeah, exactly. So whether it's like in Europe, when it is PhD by design, and there already it already implies like kind of that you continue, well, in a way, practicing and writing theory, and also like if you look at a lot of like the studios, the architectural offices in Europe, they're well, most of the times they have partly teaching, partly practicing, so it's somehow combined.
Okay, well, unfortunately, our time is up, so we have to finish. Thank you very much, Anastasiia and Piergianna, for taking part in this conversation. It was our pleasure and privilege to have you and to hear your voices and views. We also, of course, thank all the viewers and listeners in Zoom and on YouTube today and next following days. Those who would be watching and rewatching this conversation. And we also thank our interpreter, Nadezhda Lebedeva, for her contribution to this conversation. Our next event will be very, very soon on Friday. And our guests will be Anna Pujaner, an architect, researcher, and editor from Spain and teaching in the US also, and Ippolito Pistilini-Laparelli, who is an architect and curator, and among all very different projects he's involved in, he's also currently curating the Russian Pavilion for the coming Venice Architectural Biennale. I hope it will come eventually sometime. Thank you very much. Follow the announcements of all our events in our social networks and on the program website. And I hope to see you soon. Goodbye.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you all.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Yes,
thank you very
thanks
much.
to all.
Goodbye.
Bye.